A whole morning of things that I've cared about for many, many years. So it's really great to be here. So what I want to do is just sort of go back to a couple of first principles, if you will, and think about traditional firms. And I'm actually going to lump in those firms that do a lot of outsourcing as a linear supply chain. And in that context, we think of those as a relatively vertically integrated firm because they've got these longer-term contracts, so it's not easy to kind of come and go. What we've seen is a switch to a different structure. And so we've heard a lot of variations on a theme of this more triangular relationship, and we actually saw pictures that looked almost identical to this earlier this morning. And the idea is that you're facilitating a set of transactions, and you could think of these as market transactions, but they're taking place with a lot of kind of firm types of capabilities. And so as I was listening earlier today, I listened just a moment ago to Kai-Fu, and so this notion that fraud detection as a platform service is very distinct from a market, because you're aggregating data, then you're offering this up as sort of some kind of algorithm, and then it's the very type of system that tends to get better over time as more people use it. And this essentially is a classic network effect. We heard that earlier in the discussions of Ant Financial and Alipay. Very similar. Because they've got such fine-grained user data, they're able to do much more effective credit scoring and then, again, reduce fraud rates. Those are core services that the system can provide, but it's somewhere in between a pure market, because there's lots of technology, there's lots of data, there's lots of development, and a pure firm, because, in fact, people can come to this system in a relatively loose way. They can take a default contract, they can sign up as a developer, they can start to build on top. So I think we heard that earlier this morning really nicely from Michael Spence and Richard, who really kind of laid the stage for that. These systems tend to be simple at first. Google started out solving an incredibly complex problem in the PageRank algorithm, but eventually it ended up being sort of a one-sided type of market. And of course, to monetize, they opened up to other sides. Then over time, you start to build out more complex relationships. And again, all using platform technology and services, so it ends up being this intermediate form. So that's where we've been interested. Another fascinating thing that we observe is that firms can kind of have it both ways. And Amazon in particular, you observe them to act like a retailer, where they'll take all the inventory risk. But at the same time, they'll act as a market or as a platform, with big differences in both the cost structure as well as the risk profile. In their case, they're actually using that distributed set of marketplace providers as kind of a test bed to figure out, well, what's at the top of the distribution in terms of either volumes or value add. So in many ways, they're able to kind of observe the ecosystem. And then that, of course, poses quite a governance challenge, which is, do you discourage your marketplace participants if you end up taking over sort of their most profitable lines of business? And that'll end up being a theme that we'll see, and we already heard a moment ago about these kind of experiments in Taobao with different governance structures. What's really interesting for someone who started out as in a manufacturing firm? So I worked for GE Healthcare, and we made CAT scanners and MRI equipment for many years before I went back to grad school. So kind of in that 1980s time frame, a lot of what was measurable in the economy, especially in terms of market cap, was attributable to tangible things, machines, assets, factories. What we've seen over the last 30 years is an almost mirror image where the market cap of the largest firms is now composed primarily of intangibles. So of course those are things like software, those are things like intellectual property, those are things like brand, but I would actually argue that they're also strongly around network effects. And if you were to go back, say, 5 years ago and look at the average social media firm, it would be about $100 of market cap per user. And if you were to pull those numbers today or yesterday, it would be about $200. So there's actually a tremendous growth, even over just a few years, at a per user level value that they're extracting from these systems. And so, Richard, you're absolutely right. These things tend to grow in pretty interesting ways. So that then brings us to thinking through a set of fundamental questions. And we want to look at this trade-off between firms and markets. Fundamental one is, do you go it alone and produce value, or do you orchestrate others? And this has been a long puzzle. So large firms have scale. They have, sort of the equivalent of Bell Labs or the Sarnoff Labs. So why would open orchestration ever be more efficient? And of course, one answer is you've got this local advantage of where would you apply innovation that no firm could ever have. And so it would be sensible to decentralize the innovation to those players. So that's not a new story. We've known that for roughly 100 years. And markets were common, but not platforms in the scale that we're seeing them now. And so we would argue that it's because of the ability to capture these small network effects that on a per unit basis aren't worth very much. But if you can aggregate them and centralize them, then you can create tremendous value. And in fact, I think if you go back again to the talk just a moment ago by Kai-Fu, and you think about the amount of value that gets created by any one person's data, on the margin, it's probably pretty small. And so if I give you a data right in your data on the margin, I'm not going to pay you very much, even if you own it. But on the other hand, in the aggregate, so it's a collective action problem, that could be incredibly valuable data. And so you have this sort of average value, marginal value, that we haven't really sorted out, and that'll be an important issue because there's going to be some bargaining between those two extremes. So the world that we started with really came out of software. And so in prior work that I want to share a little bit of the results, we analyzed this recursive model of production where there are positive spillovers. And the idea here, to sort of frame it, is to think if you could adapt the open source software world and say, well, what if instead of your intellectual sort of contribution being immediately open, you had some innovation and then you had some right to it, but the platform reserved the right to eventually capture that and fold that back in. And in fact, that's what we see in a lot of the operating system types of models, or SAP does that, or Cisco does that. We've seen that in iOS and Android. How does that work then, and where would you sort of draw the line between deciding to do activities internally, or if there was enough development capacity externally, just choose to orchestrate that and then provide them platform resources? And in a lot of conditions, actually vertical integration makes perfect sense. But if you have enough development capability and innovation capacity out in the economy, then it makes more sense to flip the firm and then just provide those external actors the tools and the sort of contracting and the financial mechanisms to then create value and then just tax them and participate in it. And that ends up being, when network effects come large enough, you think about this shifting the locus of production from inside to outside. So to go back to some sort of easily accessible examples, you might think in a B2C example, you'd have product and service reviews. And so if you have a market and you want to be able to assess whether or not this makes sense for you, then it would be nice if others would provide honest reviews. So that's a mechanism design problem. How do you elicit truthful information? But if you can aggregate enough, then you'll get better transactions. Similarly, in a B2B example, with SAP's developer network, for example, they'll have a system where the developers will answer problems for one another. So kind of a classic users creating user value for one another. And then they pay them in sort of karma points or some sort of leaderboard. And of course, these are career concerns, and we've seen some papers on this. Josh and Jean wrote one a number of years ago. Great recognition and motivation for the developers, and SAP, by providing this sort of externally produced support, actually gets to save, at the time, and this data are a little bit older, $6 to $8 million a year with very rapid response time. That would be much more difficult if they were to just insource all of that, and they wouldn't have the local knowledge anyway of all of the specific challenges and problems. So if you were to kind of formalize this, you could say, well, we have this stack of technology, and we could simply charge a market for that value, or we can start to, in effect, create seed corn, allow others to build on that, and then they'll create value, and then over some time, you absorb the best of the innovations back into the system, and then allow others to build value on top of that. And it's that recursive nature that, in addition to some of the other types of network effect industries, we think also has an awful lot of power in explaining the growth of some of these sort of, we call them big tech or tech giants. And this was for you, Steve. I gotta get Steve's attention. So we ran a game. And the basic thing is that for a governance and regulation problem at the sort of state level, there's this tension between, are the platforms treating their developers or their users fairly, or when they absorb their innovations, are they in effect sort of mistreating them? And the answer is, of course, it depends, the worst two words in the English language. And it really matters as to whether they're acting in the interest of the overall ecosystem, or are they simply trying to privately appropriate sort of more value than they're really contributing to the system. Any one actor, if they had a valuable innovation, they made a discovery, would want to keep that private. But in aggregate, that would go badly because the entire system benefits by pooling innovations and then allowing for others to build on top of them. And we had some pretty tangible examples of this from work with companies. So Cisco provided a good one when we said, well, how do you know when it's time to take innovations from the developer base and then fold them into the core operating system? And they said, well, it's when we see the same problem get solved in vertical after vertical after vertical. And so at that point, it's clear that there's some missing functionality in the platform, and so we just fold it into the next version. And so then we asked the CTO, well, how does the developer base feel about that? He said, well, they hate it, of course, but at that point, competition is starting to erode the margins, and it's better that they have a coherent system for everybody to build on rather than some cobbled together network of individual solutions. If you go back, really back, to when Windows was not internet aware, individual applications used to have IP functionality. So you could actually have your Word or a game, and it would literally communicate with the internet, and that was each developer having to solve what was obviously a general problem individually. And so, of course, that was a clear example of something that needed to get folded back into the core. And again, no one developer, if they were profiting from that, would want to have their IP sort of folded in, but the collective is much better off. So from a regulatory point of view, when you observe the platforms sort of absorbing innovation over time, you have to ask the question, is that acting in the interest of the whole, or are they taking advantage? And more formally, we can work out, for a specific model, when it is that you would flip from producing internally to externally. And what's interesting is you can also work out the welfare implications. And from the platform's profit point of view, they would actually share a bit less of their core technology than if you were simply working to maximize welfare. And they would allow for the developers to have a bit longer time before they fold things in and effectively make them free. And it really depends on the size of the investments, and that'll actually drive longer durations of close time to allow the people making the investments to recoup them. And so I think we heard earlier today an important kind of echo of the past, which is this notion that we're really revisiting some of the outsourcing conversations that we had a generation ago. And so I actually lived through that, where When I got to GE, it was very vertically integrated, and then they started just disaggregating the firm and putting all of the component production out to a supply base. And I think that platforms are a natural extension, and that they're much more efficient because the transaction costs have gone down so much that they're able to, in effect, mimic these long-term solutions and contracts of sort of tightly controlled supply chains at lower costs and with much broader participation. So, how much should firms rely on supply chain partners for innovation? How much for capacity was a classic question from the past. And now I think a key question is, how are you going to coordinate the activities of sort of these new supply chain partners? And to kind of conclude, I'll give the 2 minutes. We clearly need better measures of network effects. So as you mentioned, we sat down and wrote very formal models, but of course the network effects come in different flavors, they have different drivers, and the question is, how much do those kind of industrial details actually end up mattering for the structure of any specific market? A lot of our work relies on this kind of software-based view of recursive production. And I had a really fun conversation with Jean at dinner, Jean Tirole, a couple of years ago, because they came upon this two-sided network idea in the context of credit card markets. And so he asked, well, how did you come upon it? I said, well, we came out of computer science, and we saw this all over the place in software development. And he kind of laughed and said, of course, because it was burbling in the economy in lots of different pockets, as we've seen. So firms have to coordinate the activities of their external producers. And one of the things that we find is that's not a natural muscle, if you will, for especially incumbent firms. There's not usually somebody that could articulate what Kai-Fu was talking about earlier today, and wouldn't necessarily have this A/B testing capacity. Who's your senior vice president of network effects? We don't even know what you're talking about, type of thing. How do you deal with developer communities? Well, we just do an enterprise sort of contract. We hire Accenture or some giant firm. They take 3 years, give us something relatively inflexible. They're not used to setting up production in these looser arrangements, and to survive, I think they're going to have to invest in figuring that out, because even to leverage things like cloud computing and these distributed developer networks, they're just not going to be able to without a different structure internally. And then, of course, we've got sets of questions about new technology, blockchain, 5G, and I think we're kind of covering a number of these at the conference. So again, it's a great pleasure. Thank you.